The general genre of horror is a pretty widespread subject to be talked about, whether it's haunted houses, horror movies, horror games, or just the idea of Halloween. However, one thing that I think isn't talked about as much is scariness related to music. And I don't mean stuff like spooky, scary skeletons or any of those Halloween songs. No, I'm talking specifically about musical horror and dread in everyday music. Well, I don't really know if you can call this everyday music, but you'll see. Horror refers to something that gives intense fear and shock, and dread refers to something that's sort of ominous in a way, like a lingering sense of fear that's not really completely in your face. At least these are my personal definitions of these two words. While it's sort of a random thing to talk about, the stuff that comes out of this medium of scary music results in some of my favorite albums and songs literally ever, and I think it's important that it's done effectively. But how do you use scariness to its advantage when making music? Well, you see, in the whole grand scheme of quote-unquote scariness in music, I like to put things in the spectrum. Kind of like a color spectrum that I sort of made myself. Ranging from the horror side of music to the dreadful side of music, and of course everything in between. This isn't a spectrum for all music. This is just music that could be classified as scary. And this video is less of a video essay and more just a giant rant. So I'm just gonna rapid fire through a lot of examples in the video and hopefully explain the points I make. With that being said, I think it's best to start off at the complete start of the spectrum with... Horror music is probably the first thing that people think of when you think of scary music. Whether that's jump scares in the songs, haunting melodies, or just a really fucked up story. Horror music is kind of a challenge to pull off well though. For example, horrorcore is a genre that doesn't have many notable albums to its name compared to other genres. But the ones considered good in this genre are usually the most well-known ones. One of the more notable groups in this genre is Clipping. Clipping's whole discography is full of messed up stories, but the two albums that are most classified as horrorcore in their catalog are There Existed an Addiction to Blood and their most recent album, Visions of Bodies Being Burned. Both of these albums have songs that each paint the most gruesome deaths you can imagine with the most desolate and dark instrumentals necessary. Although I do think Visions of Bodies Being Burned is just okay and not the greatest thing ever, I think its predecessor is honestly really damn effective in what it's trying to make you feel, and I found this album to be really gripping. There's not really that many other notable albums in the horrorcore genre though. However, that doesn't mean there aren't any memorable horrifying songs. An infamous one is Threnody? I don't know how to pronounce it. For the Victims of Hiroshima by Penderecki. A classical piece about, you guessed it, Hiroshima. That sits around 2.8 million views as of October 31st, 2024. Actually, this piece wasn't ever intended to be about Hiroshima, but when Penderecki heard this being played for the first time, he thought it would be appropriate to associate the piece with Hiroshima. I won't get too into the song because I feel it's better to listen to the horror yourself, but all I'm really gonna say is that this shit gets you tensed up for so long and is one of the most horrifying pieces of music I've ever heard. Just disturbing songs in general fit into this horror category. I mean, I don't think it's completely horror, but it definitely leans on this side of the spectrum. One of the most popular songs is known for being disturbing is Dance with the Devil by Immortal Technique, which is also considered to be one of the greatest storytelling rap songs to ever get recorded. If you don't want spoilers for the song, skip to this timestamp, but the story of the song is so batshit crazy that it's honestly kind of depressing. Like I'm telling you, writing a song about a kid wanting to be a gangster so he ends up raping and killing his own mom without knowing it was his own mom is so fucked up, I don't even know how to feel about it. And this story is told in the most detailed and compelling way possible. Like it gets you so invested that it makes the twist all the more shocking. Like my jaw was wide open when it came, and it's sad to the point where the level of storytelling is almost commendable. However, like I said earlier, stuff like this isn't always appreciated, and there's definitely a reason for it. I feel that horror-related musical content is so less common than other music because it's hard to make good horror music without being cheap or offensive. You can definitely see where it gets its way when you're dealing with disturbing samples within songs. Usually these samples are used to convey a message of some sort, but a lot of the time it just comes off as insensitive. Another example of this is JPEG Mafia's song, I Just Killed a Cop, Now I'm Horny. You already know this song's gonna be wild based on the title, and it doesn't help that the song starts off with a cop getting shot to death. Like, I get the song's about police brutality, but the users of the sample got a lot of people upset because while it is disturbing and fits the theme of the song, it doesn't make the use of it justified. It comes off to some people as insensitive, like I said earlier. I mean, I don't think the sample usage is the worst thing in the world with this song, but I understand people that think otherwise. However, another example of this that's honestly worse is Nothingness by Sewer Slut, which, I kid you not, samples a video of a guy literally blowing his brains out on a call, followed by sounds of crying. And I mean literally blowing his brains out. I won't play the sample for obvious reasons, but again, just because it's disturbing and it fits the theme of the song doesn't make the sample usage justified. Controversies like this make musical horror a very hard thing to pull off effectively, so it's no surprise that a lot of artists tend to go towards the opposite side of the spectrum, or...
The car's on fire, and there's no driver at the wheel. And the sewers are all muddied with 1,000 lonely suicides. And a dark wind blows.
What you just heard was a snippet of the first few minutes of Godspeed You Black Emperor's debut album, F Sharp A Sharp Infinity, which is an album that takes the concept of dread and plays with it throughout its entire 1 hour and 3 minute runtime. It's also considered as one of the greatest post-rock albums of all time. You see, there's way more musical content revolving around dread than music revolving around horror. Dread is something that's easier to master than horror, and at the same time is way more effective. Cause while horror is something you get scared at only a few times before you grow numb to it, dread is a feeling that's way more prominent when re-listening to a scary song. As a result, musical dread is toyed around with way more than musical horror, and is also responsible for a lot of well-praised and downright fantastic albums. Godspeed You Black Emperor, for example, is a really prominent band of dreadful music. I already mentioned F Sharp A Sharp Infinity, but their most recent album, No Title, is also a really desolate album. Quite possibly their bleakest project to date since the 2000s, which makes a lot of sense considering that this album is based on the real-life Israel and Palestine conflict. Post-rock in general does the most for dread. For example, the band Swans. Oh my god, I've been waiting to talk about this band, because they're arguably the most iconic post-rock group ever, and for good reason. Albums like To Be Kind and Glowing Man have such a constant feeling of dread, fear, and sometimes downright catharsis that makes these projects so compelling, with To Be Kind being the main apocalypse and The Glowing Man being the post-apocalypse, almost like a rebirth of mankind. It's even crazier that these albums are literally 2 hours long, with some songs being above 20 minutes long. Their most recent album, The Beggar, is what I think to be their most dreadful album and takes full advantage of that lingering sense of fear. This project is also 2 hours long, but it feels slow. Really slow. Even for a Swans album. And a lot of tracks are short for a Swans album as well, with a lot of them not even being over 10 minutes. But at the same time, it's rewarding as hell, with songs like The Parasite that feel like you're going straight to purgatory. Not to mention the absolute fucking behemoth that is the 43-minute track near the end of the track list, The Beggar Lover 3. Post-rock isn't even the only genre that pampers with the concept of dread. Injury Reserve's By the Time I Get to Phoenix was absolutely mind-numbing and quite frankly dumbfounding the first time I listened to it. Like, I just want you to picture this, okay? Injury Reserve. A 3-person group consisting of Nathaniel, Parker, and Groggs. And during quarantine, they unfortunately lose Groggs and the other two are devastated. So tell me what these motherfuckers do? That's right, they literally make the best album they've made in their whole career. Like, this shit sounds so desolate and chaotic that I was absolutely floored on multiple occasions while listening to this. I think the best thing I've heard someone call this album is post-rap, and hopefully some random batshit crazy dude ends up making something like this again. I think one of the most popular albums on this side of the spectrum is definitely Everywhere at the End of Time by The Caretaker. Despite the constant shitposting about this album that's been going on, this album is known to be absolutely terrifying solely due to its theming, dementia. Just the thought of the music you're listening to just deteriorating over 6 hours does not sound like a fun experience. And while I haven't listened to the full thing myself, I commend people that have, because this album is one of those things that could absolutely break you if you're not in the right headspace. But it's also equally impressive that this one man made some of the most compelling 6 hours of music to ever be created, and for that to be praised by millions of random people on the internet. I've talked about horror in music and dread in music, but some of my favorite music of all time actually comes with music that's a blend of these two traits, or basically just these aren't as common as the other sections I discussed, but a lot of the records that decided to combine these two worlds into one end up being projects that are completely different from anything I've ever heard. A really good example of this is Lingua Ignota Sinner Get Ready. Caligula is also like this as well, but I haven't listened to that whole album yet, so I'll only be focusing on Sinner Get Ready. And this album is so unlike anything I've ever listened to that it barely feels like actual music sometimes. Like, seriously, the first track alone has noise jump scares. Yes, jump scares of literal noise. And throughout the whole album, the music consists of harsh drone noises and some of the most angelic singing I've ever heard. It quite literally breaks so many fundamentals about music that I can think of. And yet, it's the sole reason why I love it so much. Albums like this are music that isn't really meant to be replayable in the slightest, and I respect this album so much for it. I know I talked about Swans earlier, but this series is also a big culprit of using horror and dread to its advantage. 93 Avenue Blues alone is terrifying, being one of the most shortest on the album, but also having a giant ass jump scare near the end as well. Okay, maybe that's one of the only few horror elements about this album, but this year in general is way more menacing than the other albums they made that I mentioned previously. Not to mention that having the vinyl myself makes the experience of this album 10 times more immersive. And hearing stuff like the first few minutes of the title track is enough to make me piss my pants. When you're exploring music on this section of the spectrum, it gets to a point where some of the albums get genuinely absurd, like Daughter of Darkness for example, which has 18 songs in total and has a runtime of 7 fucking hours. I am dead serious. I haven't listened to the full thing yet, but I've listened to some of it, and I'm scared for the day I end up approaching it, cause holy shit, from the stuff I've heard, this album sounds like tribal music you found like centuries ago, and I mean it in the most terrifying way possible. It's like ambience of some sorts, but like way more terrifying. Again, this stuff is genuinely absurd, and I refuse to believe that some of these projects were made by real people. The Lamb is Effigy by Sprint is, oh my god, holy shit, do I have a story to tell you about this album. This is more of a recent album being released in 2023, but do you have any idea how my first experience with this album was like? The shit in this album was so absolutely preposterous, I felt like I went through psychosis during half the runtime. Like, I just want you to imagine the general genre of post-rock, but instead having way more harsh noise, dragging on to a point where it's hypnotic, and having one of the most schizophrenic vocalists I've ever heard in my life. The amount of jump scares, harmonized symphonies, emotion, margin for error alone may quite possibly be one of the greatest songs to have ever graced my ears. Okay, let me slow down for a bit. I know I'm glazing hard as hell right now, but The Lamb is Effigy is one of my favorite albums of all time currently. And if I somehow find music better than this, then so God help me, I might kill myself the day that happens. Although the amount of albums and songs I've shown throughout the video are the most notable of the spectrum, there is still so much more music to be discovered right now and more music to be made in the future. There's so many more ways to display these types of emotions and so much potential on this side of the musical world. I mean, who knows? Someone could make something so groundbreaking that it could change the terrifying aspects of music and how it's approached forever. The possibilities are literally endless.